Tell us about the fourth anniversary of the Brexit referendum. How are you celebrating it?
I'm not really. I'm sitting here. I've got a broken foot, so I'll sunbathe in my garden and feel sorry for myself. But fourth anniversary of the vote, maybe, but nothing's changed yet. And I think that's a pretty poor indictment of politics for the modern age, isn't it? That 4 years later, we're still paying in, we're still under EU rules and regulations, and we still don't know what our future relationship's going to look like.
Yes. Well, I mean, you've really made me feel depressed now. I mean, here I was trying to be all happy and upbeat about it, and now you're telling me that actually I should be incredibly sort of dismal about it. But I mean, to be fair, it did take 3.5 of those 4 years to actually get to a point where we could get a government that could enact what the people wanted.
Yeah, it did. But, the risk is what actually happened was Theresa May drew up this abhorrent deal that Boris Johnson himself called vassalage. The EU essentially wanted to take that to the bank and say, I'm going to cash that in. The UK is going to essentially be a satellite state. When Boris Johnson became leader, he was so desperate to unlock that logjam in Parliament. He needed to demonstrate that he had made progress with the EU. He needed to say, look, I've got this brand new deal. We're going to get this through Parliament, vote for us, and this whole quagmire that we've got stuck in is going to disappear. But what he did really is just put the same deal in a different package. So now the EU want to go and bank that again. And it's got all sorts of things that we really don't want to be tied into via the new protocol for Northern Ireland. There's future customs arrangements. There's coming under state aid regulation and a whole lot of other stuff that we actually don't even know the detail of yet. And so, we're sort of a lot further down the line now, but I'm not particularly confident that we're going to end up with the full fat freedom that I think most members of the public hoped that we would.
Yes, and I know that you've been writing in the Telegraph and elsewhere about this kind of thing, and you've been talking to the newspapers about this. But, I mean, at the end of the day, it does seem to me that Michel Barnier has changed his tune to some extent, that Europe and Brussels in particular is no longer speaking to us as though we are the recalcitrant child that needs to be controlled. They're speaking to us now with a sort of newfound respect. Do you not share that view?
I don't think there was ever a lack of respect, particularly from the Belgian side of things, from Brussels, from the EU 27. But I think that there was a whole frustration while we had these, battles going on in Parliament, especially. At least they know they're dealing with a majority now. But you've got to listen closely to what Michel Barnier is saying, and you'll notice that again and again he talks up the political declaration. Now, what that is this appendage. It's about 25 pages long. It's this appendage that Boris Johnson added on to the withdrawal agreement and took out all the nasty stuff from the withdrawal agreement, stuck it in the political declaration, and said this isn't legally binding. But it ties into the original withdrawal agreement, which is now international treaty. That statute in UK law. It ties in under this paragraph which explains best endeavours. So we have to show we're using best endeavours to make sure that the political declaration is fulfilled. Legally, that feels a bit wishy-washy, and there's a very different continental view as to what that would infer. But I think that this is going to be a long-run battle, and Michel Barnier is a very, very clever negotiator. From the beginning, he had our backs against the ropes. He had a very useful apparatchik with Ollie Robbins, who was the previous negotiator before Sir David Frost, who himself is an EU federalist. So they managed to extract everything they wanted out of the UK early doors, and now they're really wanting to cash that in. And we don't have enough detail about what's going on in those meetings and how firm we're going to be able to stand, quite frankly.
No, I get that. But I mean, on the other hand, we are in the midst, I guess, of a pandemic. It's not been, I suppose, Boris Johnson's best choice. I mean, I don't think if you'd asked Boris in January, how would you like things to play out for the first 6 months of the year? And he wouldn't have said, well, what we'd like to do is see this pandemic engulfing the entire world, which will mean we'll have to shut down the economy in the middle of March and then not wake up from it until maybe the end of September. So, I mean, in a way, it's quite remarkable that any negotiations have been going on at all, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and the rumour has it that Michel Barnier was the one who gave Boris Johnson COVID-19. But, I'm not going to comment on that. Who knows? Yeah. There was apparently that was a little sort of deal that they did in a negotiation.
The ultimate parting gift.
Exactly. Yeah, they exchanged some viral particles. At least we've traded something. But no, I mean, look, you can actually say that the pandemic's worked in our favour, because what the pandemic has shown is that we're able to adapt very quickly to a crisis. It's also shown that we have a great global dependency on getting certain things, whether it's PPE being manufactured, whether it's access to medicines, whether it's access to reagents to make antibody tests, and the necessity to live in a global marketplace. And we're now faced with an EU which is going to face its own huge huge looming debt crisis. When you look at the nations of the EU that are the most hardest hit by the pandemic and went into absolute lockdown, you're looking at Italy and Spain, and those two countries have the highest debt to GDP ratios. So they're going to end up with another single currency crisis. And I don't think there are many nations in the EU who are looking at the negotiations of Brexit and thinking at this stage in time it would be a good idea if they suddenly lost access to our markets and vice versa. So that could actually help us out a little bit. But, I don't think we should look at the fact that we've had this crisis as any sort of thing that should stall negotiations. I mean, look, we're talking on Zoom right now. I'm not a big fan. I'm looking forward to being able to come back into studios. But the negotiations have been hard at work this entire time, and one could argue actually there's been fewer distractions and there's been fewer press concentration. I mean, perhaps one blessing is normally, if there hadn't been a pandemic, the newspapers would be absolutely tearing apart every single aspect of those negotiations. There'd be leaks, there'd be mischief. You'd have Michel Barnier writing to his favourite Remainer pen pals in the Palace of Westminster. So I think it's taken a little bit of stress and duress off those talks, the fact that they haven't been in the limelight.
Yes, I think that's right. But equally, I mean, we are still, I think, in a much better position, surely, are we not, Alex, than we were, say, a year ago, certainly than we were 2 years ago, because that whole process, the 4 years that we've had to sit through and wonder about. And, I remember going back to as far away as like October of last year. Do you remember when we all went into work on a Saturday because before Oliver Letwin screwed everything up, it was meant to be the day that something was going to happen, and we sat there hours and hours and hours on end where nothing actually happened. And so I take your point, and I understand why you are, shall we say, sceptical about what's going on. But we are surely in a much better position to negotiate now than we have ever been. And as you say, with the way that the EU has become sort of defunded, if you like, because there is so little money around from the contributing countries, they're not going to want to give us a hard time. They are not going to want to see trade between us and the EU in some way becoming, more detrimental than it is now, are they?
No, well, they're not going to. Defunded is interesting. They're far from that. They've actually been drawing on resources left, right and centre, including from us, actually, to pay these pandemic payouts to the worst affected economies. And it's still not clear. Look, even though we said we're not extending the transition period, there's still time for that to happen, realistically. And we don't know what the shape of that future deal is going to be yet. And it could run all the way up to the 11th hour, and it could be the UK who ends up capitulating. You're already seeing moves afoot in Westminster and reading little, snippets of leaks and gossip from the corridors of power that there might be manoeuvres in place to try and dethrone Boris Johnson. We had the whole furore, remember, over Dominic Cummings, which I think a lot of those in the know who exist within the Westminster bubble very clearly read as an effort once again to remove what people think is the linchpin of these negotiations, the person who's really going to put his foot down and push for a hard Brexit, remove him from any position of power or influence. Perhaps, that's an overestimation of the sort of influence that Dominic Cummings yields. But it's very clear that behind the scenes, you've still got the same efforts taking place. You've still got characters in the Labour Party and the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, who will do anything they can, use any might they can, and any legal persuasion they can to try and get their own way and water down Brexit and dilute it. And what I'm concerned about is where we're not really looking at the devil in the detail yet with that political declaration, there is this very, very tricky hook, this very, very tricky loophole that EU can use to say the UK has not used best endeavours to fulfil the promises they made in that political declaration during negotiations. But a lot of this is still to play for, and we're just not hearing much detail.
No. And would you expect in the coming weeks to learn more about what it is that they're doing? I mean, we've been told by Boris Johnson that he expects a deal to have been done sort of by the end of the summer, by which I take to mean the end of August. I'm not quite sure if that's nebulous or not. But I mean, surely we should be able to implore Boris and the negotiators that if they're going to Brussels and not getting what they want, then we should just have no deal at all, shouldn't we?
Well, no deal planning's gone. It's basically being stopped. So I don't really feel like that's on the cards anymore, which is a shame, because I think that if you're going to get a quickie deal, in the same way that Boris Johnson said, I've been negotiating, Theresa May had been chatting away with Brussels for 2 years and hadn't really sort of, produced anything that anybody in Parliament found acceptable from either side of the debate. Boris Johnson took about 2 weeks, came back waving a bit of paper and said, look, I've got it, isn't this fantastic? Well, quite frankly, a few full stops were moved around. Yeah. And so what concerns me the most is if we're going to secure a super fast last deal by summer, which, Boris Johnson loves saying, look, wham, bam, haven't I done something spectacular? Haven't I pulled another rabbit out of another hat? You think, well, for the EU to go down that route and say, yes, fine, we'll let ink dry on this, it's going to be something that's on their terms. It's going to be what's in that political declaration. So before you start, popping champagne on the 4-day anniversary, there's a long way to go. We're nowhere near out of the woods yet. All we've managed to do so far is sign a really dreadful divorce bill into international treaty, which keeps us on the hook for a whole load of things forthcoming. And we haven't even decided what we're going to do. We're 1 foot in, 1 foot out at the moment. Yes, technically on paper, we have left, but that is basically just, technically on paper. In every other way, shape or form during this transition period, we're a paid up member state, and we don't know what we are transitioning to. And that's the way the EU staged these negotiations quite deliberately, to get their money from us, to tie us into, a sort of ramshackle set of ambitious promises, and then say, right, the clock's ticking, and now this has got to be fulfilled. And I'm afraid, we've been jumping through their hoops. And my fear is trying to rush something through to sate the general public and say, haven't I achieved this spectacular goal, could end up actually being an own goal.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't take much for me to have an excuse to open a bottle of champagne, it has to be said, Alex. But are you worried as well about the likes of Ed Davey and people like him who keep continually standing up in the House of Commons and saying, oh, but, surely we should have an extension because we have still to negotiate things which might take longer than a few weeks, and we really need to prolong this whole kind of process. I mean, I'm hoping that nobody will give that any credence at all. But is there a chance that could get some traction?
There's always a chance for everything. And the EU's the master of rewriting rules last minute to suit their own purposes. Ed Davies about as scary as an aphid, but what is scary is the legal opportunities here to challenge whatever Boris Johnson comes back with. And like I said, Michel Barnier is already writing to people on the Remain side and filling them in on details. Look, it wasn't that long ago that we had the multiple letter saga when Boris had to ask for an extension to avoid crashing out because it had gone through the courts and so on and so forth. And he wrote 2 letters to Donald Tusk, one saying, I've been forced to send this letter, and one being the letter itself. And again, it was just using spin and smoke and mirrors to try and be the good guy, but actually capitulating to what the Remain side wanted because it had been won legally. And that's the danger here. Despite all of the, pomp and the bluster of Johnson, what legally is he beholden to?
Yes, quite. Finally, Alex, because we're running out of time, you must have one great memory from the last 4 years. What is it?
One great memory for the past 4 years. What is this since? Is this since the actual vote? I think my greatest memory is not having a memory on the 24th because I was at a very good party on the results night. So there you are.
Okay, so you don't remember what happened. You're thereby absolving yourself of all guilt. Very well played. Alex Phillips, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure you'll hear her soon on Talk Radio. She was on Plank of the Week last week, judging us. This week we've got Belinda de Lucy, her former colleague as an MEP for the Brexit Party as well. This is Talk Radio.